They were so confident when they cut you off, so loud when they shut the door, so proud when they lit the match and watched the bridge burn, thinking they'd never need to cross it again. They called it closure. You called it clarity. Because while they were celebrating the end, you were already building something they'd never have access to again. Peace. Not the fragile kind that needs constant approval, but the kind that comes from walking away and never looking back. Back then, you didn't argue. You didn't fight to stay. You saw the flames, felt the heat, and stepped back in silence. And they mistook that silence for weakness. They thought you'd come crawling back once the smoke cleared. But the smoke didn't choke you. It cleared the view. You saw them for who they really were. And once you see clearly, you never unsee it. You didn't walk away because you gave up. You walked because you saw no value in fighting for a place where your presence was disposable. You didn't scream. You didn't make threats. You just disappeared. And that disappearance, that was your power move. No words, no warnings, just distance. And the cold truth that some bridges aren't meant to be rebuilt. Now they stand at the edge of that burned path, staring across the ashes, whispering your name. But you're too far gone. And the silence they once celebrated, it's screaming louder than ever. At first, they didn't notice your absence. They were too busy validating each other's decisions, rewriting the story so you'd look like the problem. That's what people do when they destroy something they secretly depended on. They justify the fire and convince themselves they lit it for a reason. But time has a way of separating truth from ego, and the longer you stayed gone, the more their narrative fell apart. You weren't reaching out. You weren't explaining. You weren't watching from a distance. You weren't watching at all. And that's what made them uneasy. Because you didn't just leave. You erased the idea of returning. You found new paths. You built new connections. You created a version of yourself they never thought you could become. Unreachable. The silence started working on them, quietly, slowly, like a pressure in their chest they couldn't shake. And now they're pacing that burned-down bridge, remembering the things they said, the things they didn't say, and the version of you they assumed would always be available. But that version's gone. What remains is someone who survived the fire and realized they never needed the bridge in the first place. You didn't just walk away. You learned how to walk alone. And once you learn that, no apology, no excuse, no sudden guilt trip can bring you back. They thought time would soften you, that eventually the distance would wear you down and make you nostalgic. But they underestimated what silence really builds. While they sat in circles recycling blame, you evolved in silence. You learned to enjoy the calm that came after chaos. You got stronger, not in the obvious ways they expected, but in the quiet choices you made daily. What not to respond to, who not to chase, what to let die without explanation. You stopped missing what wasn't real. You stopped grieving what was never mutual. Their absence didn't hurt the way they hoped it would. It healed you, because closure doesn't come from them. It comes from the moment you stop waiting for it. And that moment, it's long gone. Now they're revising history. Suddenly, their actions weren't malicious. They were misunderstood. Their silence wasn't cruelty. It was confusion. But you know better. You remember the smirks, the dismissals, the cold confidence they had while watching you walk away. They never thought they'd need to cross back. And now that they do, they don't know how. The bridge is ash. You don't even stand on the same ground anymore. They're waving across a void, hoping guilt will do what their pride couldn't. Bring you back. But guilt doesn't work. When you've outgrown the version of yourself who used to beg for crumbs. Now you build tables, and their seat, it's gone. You've seen it before, the sudden check-ins, the vague apologies, the carefully crafted messages that dance around accountability. They don't say sorry. They say, I've been thinking about you. They don't ask to rebuild. They ask if you remember the good times. It's never direct, never honest, because directness would mean admitting they made a mistake. And for people who destroy bridges, humility comes last. After the loneliness, after the silence, after they realize the world isn't as kind when you don't have someone like you in it. But you don't take the bait. Not this time. You've learned that not every message deserves a reply. Not every apology deserves an audience. Some people don't miss you. They miss your access. They miss what you gave them. Energy, validation, loyalty they never earned. Now they want it back, without changing, without healing, without acknowledging what they broke. You've changed too much to fit back into the space they abandoned. You don't trust nostalgia anymore. You know how selective it is, how it filters out pain and leaves only highlights. But you remember everything. The disrespect, the silence when you needed them, the sudden coldness they thought you'd tolerate forever. You didn't forget. You just stopped needing revenge. Because you got something better. Distance. And with that distance came clarity. You no longer hope they understand. You hope they sit with their own echo and realize how loud your absence really is. They forgot who you become when you're left alone. They thought silence would make you weak, unaware that solitude is where you sharpened your edge. While they moved on, you moved deeper into your purpose, your peace, your precision. And now that they're circling back, they don't recognize you. You don't smile the same. You don't ask how they've been. You don't fill the silence with small talk. You simply observe and keep moving. That's what unnerves them. You're not angry. You're not bitter. You're indifferent. And that's the one thing they can't manipulate. Because anger means you still care. Indifference means you've detached. And detachment is the final blow. It tells them they lost something they can't replace. Not because you're irreplaceable, but because you made the decision to stop being available. They underestimated how powerful it is to be unavailable, to not answer, to not react, to not open doors that were once slammed in your face. That's not cruelty. That's self-respect. They want to talk about healing now, about timing, about growth. But growth doesn't beg to be seen. It shows up in silence and changes the entire room. And your silence, it's louder than anything they've said since. They didn't burn the bridge because they were brave. They did it because they thought you'd never have the strength to let it stay in ruins. But you did. And now the only thing left on their side is smoke, regret, and a memory of someone they never thought would walk away for good. If silence became your power, subscribe and let it echo. You've outgrown what they're still trying to understand. You've reached a place they never believed you'd go, not because it's far, but because it's silent. There's no spotlight here, no applause, just clarity, just distance, just results. The kind that doesn't need to be shared because the ones who need to see it already feel it. Every time they open their mouths to tell the story, they hesitate because they know you're not who you used to be, and they're no longer sure what version of you they're allowed to mention. They keep trying to revisit what they destroyed, not to repair it, but to pretend it never happened. But you're not confused. You know the difference between regret and reflection. You know how guilt sounds when it's dressed as nostalgia, and you no longer reward recycled energy with new chances, because that's how you lose yourself, by reopening doors that should have stayed shut forever. You don't look back anymore, not out of pride, but out of preservation, because what you rebuilt in your silence is too strong to be handed back to the hands that broke it. You're not mad, you're focused, and that focus terrifies them. It's the absence of emotion they never expected, the kind that doesn't want revenge but refuses to return. They thought you'd soften, you got sharper. They thought you'd wait, you got faster. They thought you'd beg, you forgot how to ask. Now they're left calling out into a silence that doesn't echo back. Because you've moved so far forward, even your shadow no longer lingers behind. They watch you from a distance now, trying to read your silence like it's still a question. But silence isn't a question anymore, it's a verdict. And the sentence, exile. You didn't make a scene when you left, but you left a scar. Not with rage, just absence. Not with words, just results. And that's what stings the most. You didn't punish them. You outgrew them. And nothing haunts louder than being excluded from a life you once underestimated. They replay conversations, looking for the exact moment the bridge collapsed, hoping to find a reason that absolves them. But there is no moment, because it wasn't one thing, it was everything. The dismissals, the backhanded compliments, The emotional negligence they called normal, they didn't burn the bridge all at once. They chipped away at it until there was nothing left to stand on. And now that they've fallen, they look for you to throw them a rope. But you're not a lifeline anymore. You're not a fix. You're not a second chance. You're a different person. One who knows that sometimes the best way to heal is to disappear so completely that they never get the chance to hurt you again. They used to call you sensitive. Now they call you distant. What they don't realize is you're still the same person. You just finally gave your silence a job. Protection. The silence wasn't passive. It was a decision, not made out of pride, but out of precision. You didn't just remove yourself. You removed their access to you, to your time, your energy, your loyalty. The bridge wasn't just burned. It was replaced with a wall they can't climb, not because they don't want to, because they no longer have permission. That's what they struggle to accept. That access to you was never a right. It was a privilege. And once lost, it doesn't get restored by apologies whispered through regret. It gets earned, if it ever gets earned at all. And for them, that door is locked. Not out of spite, out of standards. You're no longer moved by memories, no longer softened by the past. What you built in their absence is more valuable than what you shared during their presence. Because what you built was real. It didn't depend on their validation. It didn't beg for inclusion. It stood on its own, just like you learned to do. They don't want to rebuild. They want to rewind. But you know better now. You know that people who destroy foundations don't get to live in the new house. They forfeited their future the moment they made your value conditional. And now, no matter how they frame their return, the answer remains the same. It's too late. You're not cold. You're clear. You're not angry. You're aligned. And in a world where bridges burn easily, you've learned to build peace on your own island and guard the shoreline with silence. Now they romanticize what they once rejected. They talk about the past like it was perfect, conveniently skipping over the disrespect, the neglect, the silence they gave you when you needed words. They act like it ended suddenly, like the fire came out of nowhere, but you remember how slow the burn was, how long you stood there, holding water, begging them to stop throwing matches. They didn't just let the bridge burn. They poured fuel and smiled as it lit up. And now, with the flames gone and the ash settled, they reach out, hesitant, selective, hoping you'll respond like you used to. But you don't, because you're not their comfort zone anymore. You're not the old version of yourself who needed their approval to feel enough. You're not someone who'll lower your standards just to feel accepted again. You've rebuilt in silence, in discipline, in depth. And they can't follow you here, not because you hate them, but because they don't belong in the peace you fought to create. They burned their way out. You're not responsible for guiding them back. You don't seek revenge. You don't need closure. You don't even want recognition. What you want, and finally have, is freedom. And freedom isn't found in forgiveness forced by guilt. It's found in never needing to be in the same room with them again. They want the bridge back, but you've learned how to fly. You never announced your exit. You didn't make a speech. You didn't demand closure. You just stopped showing up, quietly, entirely. And in doing so, you created something far more powerful than revenge. Absence. The kind they feel in rooms you no longer enter, in moments where your voice used to offer calm, in memories they now replay with a different tone. They thought they won when you walked away. They didn't realize you were the prize. Now, they speak of change, of growth, of second chances, but change isn't proven in words. It's proven in choices. And every choice they made when it mattered said you didn't. So now, your silence doesn't just represent distance. It represents standards, boundaries, and the final word they'll never hear. You didn't build a wall, you became one. And on the other side is everything you built without them. Peace, clarity, strength. None of it loud, all of it earned. They may knock. They may cry. They may plead. But you've learned not to answer doors you've already locked from the inside. Because some bridges burn for a reason. Some absences are permanent. And some people only realize your value when they're left watching you from the edge. Too late. Too lost. Too far behind. Let them stand in the ashes. Let them remember who held the match, and let them know that silence was always your loudest answer.